But this group is also actually about getting some practical solutions and answers. And I have to thank, well, on my own behalf really, but also the Millennium Trust, all of the partners in the working group, because collectively we put in an initial £250,000 between us all, which is funding some real practical research and trialling. And so we're going to have a couple of presentations about that now. Firstly, Emily Fensom from Forestry Commission, who is, I understand this isn't your presentation, Emily, you're giving this Ian's presentation. I'm sure you'll explain that. And then Nicola, I've lost Nicola now. Oh, hi Nicola, from Till Hill. Emily, I think you're first up.
Hi everybody. Just make sure that that's moving along. Okay, perfect. It's great to be here. Thanks very much for inviting me to speak. This slide gives the impression that I'm sort of 50% part of a double act for this presentation, and I think that's a little bit overgenerous, to be honest. I've had very little to do with the research, but unfortunately my colleague Ian wasn't able to be here today to speak to you, so he's asked if I could come along and give you a bit of an update about the research that's being done by Forest Research into alternatives to plastic tree shelters. So I'm going to speak about that for around 15 minutes or so. And Ian's very kindly said that I can pop his email address up at the end of the presentation, so if you've got any difficult questions you can direct them to him. So I get off quite lightly really. All right, we'll get stuck in then. So with just a little bit of background to start us off then. So tree shelters, they were invented by the Forestry Commission in the 1970s by a researcher called Graham Tuley. They were patented and they were then gifted to the sector, who have taken on development of the product since the 1990s. By all accounts, have been very successful, with tens of millions of them produced worldwide. Why is that then? Why have they become so successful? Well, there's quite a few advantages of tree shelters. Generally speaking, they are the cheapest way of protecting trees from browsing on areas of sort of less than about a hectare, really. They make it much easier to weed around trees. They provide a physical protection when you're using herbicides. They can be used without risk of damaging the trees, and mechanical control is much easier as well. They may also help to improve survival, and they may also help to improve growth if they're vented. If they're not vented, there are a few question marks around that. And they also provide a visible demonstration of activity on a site. However, there are some disadvantages of tree shelters as well. They can encourage shoot growth rather than root and diameter growth. They tend to discourage dense tree spacing and can then contribute to poor tree form. If they're not collected, as we've discussed, they form a source of plastic pollution in the forest at the end of their life. So to address this, many manufacturers have recently developed tree shelters that they claim can be safely left in the forest to biodegrade. So what's the issue here then? Well, unfortunately, some of the claims about these novel products, they've not yet been backed up by credible evidence, and some of the claims around them are misleading. So because of that, then, there's been a need which has been generated for independent research into the suitability of these different products and the approaches. So in recognition of this, 14 organisations from across the UK and Ireland have come together to fund an independent research project, and we've got the partners listed here, and there are several other important participants as well. We've got other partners who are involved who are providing essential expertise, guidance and support by the Forestry Plastics Working Group, and amongst others they are Till Hill, Comfor, NRW and Cheviot Trees. So the aim of the research that this cross-industry group have funded is to determine the practicality, the durability and the efficacy of alternatives to conventional, so fossil-based plastic tree shelters. The approach that's been taken to kind of work through this aim then is through a series of field experiments. So we're going to be looking at the efficacy, the durability and the impacts of on tree growth of these products. And that's being carried out across 4 sites initially. So 4 experiment sites, and on each experiment sites we're going to be having a look at 2 tree species being used, oak and rowan. 20 different treatments and approaches are being looked at initially. So to give you an idea of the sort of scale that we're looking at, that equates to around 200 plots with over 3,000 plants and products being trialled. And that's replicated across each site, so they are quite large replicated field experiments. In addition, there's a couple of other things that are going on. Forest Research are carrying out a time and method study, so they're having a look at the comparative costs of materials that are being used and of the installation costs as well, and also the practicality of each different approach, because that's an important part of the story as well. Forest Research are also having a look at the likely endpoints for these products, so they're asking for evidence from manufacturers of independently viable tests of biodegradation, which we've heard a little bit more about this morning already, the constituents that are produced and the ecotoxicity, so that might be following standards like BSEN 17033. Okay, so what progress have Forest Research made to date? Well, it's a 5-year study. Currently, we're only in the first year of the research, so it really is very early days. One site has been fully established, so this is the first site as part of the field experiment in Glenmore Forest in the Cairngorms. There's a photograph of it on the left-hand side of the slide there. You can see it's an exposed upland location, so it's a great place to be able to test some of these products. We've also got a site which has been partially established at Tunstall Forest in Suffolk. That's on the Forestry England estate. By contrast, that is a much more sheltered, dry, and lowland site. And we've also got 2 further sites which are being established this winter. One in South Wales on the NRW estate, so Natural Resources Wales estate, and a further one in Devon on the Forestry England estate. So on the photograph there on the left-hand side of the slide, that's just to show you the site at Tunstall Forest in Suffolk. And just to talk about a little bit of additional progress. So Forest Research have also been working on that time and method study, which I mentioned. That's been completed. The results are being written up at the moment. And Forest Research have also been involved with developing a questionnaire, which they've sent out to manufacturers to try and gather a little bit more information around biodegradability, the evidence around that. That's been sent out, and the majority of the responses have been returned. Forest Research have also been working in partnership with the University of Plymouth to have a look at on-site biodegradation. And so this brings us to having a look at some of the challenges then. So I think one of them is that the funding that we've been received so far from all of the partners is very welcome, but additional funding is needed for us to be able to expand the research out onto new sites, to extend the geographic coverage, and to be able to, for us to bring new products onto sites and to trial those as well. Another challenge is that everybody wants an answer to this question now, but unfortunately it takes time to develop and implement and carry out a proper study and to be able to write up and disseminate the results. And it's also quite possible that not everybody will like the eventual answers that we may have, and I'll talk about this in a little bit more detail later on. So what I'm going to do now is just run through some of the examples of the treatments that are being trialled as part of the research experiment. I haven't got time to talk through them all today, so omission of a particular product or an approach, it doesn't imply anything, it's just simply that I wouldn't have time to talk through everything this morning. But my colleague Ian has got a full list of all of the treatments that are involved in the experiment, so if you have any questions about a particular product, he's very happy for you to get in touch. Okay, so this is an example of one of the active controls that's being used in the experiment. This is a conventional plastic, so fossil-based plastic tree shelter produced by Tubex. This is another approach which is being looked at as part of the experiment. This is wire netting, and you can see that you've got the tree growing up inside there. And a slightly different approach. So this is the use of tricho repellent. So this is a repellent which is approved for use by the Health and Safety Executive in England. And it's a repellent which is based on sheep's fat. So apologies, I don't know how easy it is to make out from this photo. I actually really struggled with it the first time I looked at the slide, but there is a very small tree in the center of that photo which has been sprayed white, so you'll probably just be able to see the base of it. So the white markings on the stem there, that's where it's actually been sprayed with the repellent. And what we need to know and what we need to see, I suppose, is how long that protection lasts, whether it will protect the new growth of the tree as well. This is a similar approach where Forest Research have used sheep's wool and glued it to the tree stem. So it's unbleached sheep's wool which is being used there. So you've potentially got a couple of things happening. You've potentially got the impacts or effects of the lanolin, and also the physical barrier of the sheep's wool as well may provide a protective effect. So it's been glued onto the stem, and you can see it's looking a little bit windswept, but it is holding up quite well to the winds at the Glenmore Forest site there. Another approach which is being taken as part of the experiment is a more silvicultural approach. So what you've got here is you've got an oak tree which is growing surrounded by 3 hawthorn trees. So the idea is there that they'll provide almost like a protective barrier of thorny shrubs. So the oak will then grow up with the hawthorn, and that will be able to potentially protect it from browsing by deer. Okay, so some of the novel products which Forest Research are testing, this is one of them. This is the Tubex Nature. Also got the Vigilis Bio. And a slightly different approach here. So this is where Forest Research have taken an old conventional fossil-based plastic tree shelter, and they're reusing it or recycling it, if you like. And this was an approach which I think was introduced by a gentleman called Andrew Gray, who spoke to my colleague Ian about it. And what's happened here is it's a Tubex tree shelter, which has been removed from the tree by slitting it down the length there, and then rewrapping it around a new tree and securing it with silicon bands. This is an example of one of the cardboard tree shelters which is being tested as part of the product. This is the earthboard tree guard, and I think Forest Research are testing 4 different cardboard tree shelters as part of the research trial. A slightly different example, this is an industrially compostable guard from Germany. This is the BioWit Kilmer Wit Light, and you can see that it's a very fine mesh there with the tree growing up inside. Okay, and finally, another example of a product that is being marketed as a biodegradable tree guard. This is the BMP Tree Hugger Guard. So what about some results then? Well, as I said, it's some very early days for this research. We are only in the first year of the experiment, so FR haven't been able to carry out any formal assessments yet, and therefore it is really just too early to be able to judge the efficacy of these products. However, we have been aware that the Glenmore Forest site represents very testing conditions. It's recently been hit by Storm Arwen, so if things are going to stand up there, then it's quite likely that they're going to stand up in lots of places. So the evidence that Forest Research have managed to gather, I understand, is quite mixed around biodegradability, and even where there is credible evidence, it's really important to note that biodegradation will only usually start once the material has photodegraded and it's been incorporated into the soil, and we heard a bit more about that this morning. And even then, if we're going to talk about caveats, I suppose it's worth mentioning that even the gold standard for biodegradability tests, so if we're thinking about something like BSCN 17033, that's not a biodegradability test which is specific to tree shelters. That's actually a test which is specific for biodegradable plastic mulch films. And even then, these tests only need to show that 90% of the product will biodegrade in 2 years. So just something to be aware of. So I mentioned that I may bring a slightly unwelcome answer to the talk this morning, and I think what I'm suggesting is, because there's still lots that we don't know, until we get more data, for now, if you need to use individual tree protection, and you may not need to because there may be lots of other approaches which are suitable for your sites, the most effective, least impact approach is probably to use the traditional plastic tree shelters, fully collect them, recover them, and recycle them before they start to degrade. Collection and recycling is expected as part of the English Woodland Creation Offer, and it's accounted for within the grant offer itself. The cost of doing this is similar to using the products which are marketed as biodegradable and leaving them in situ. But it doesn't mean that you shouldn't try novel products on a small scale, because the more that we learn about them, the better that is, and the more that we'll be able to understand how they work. But remember, if you do use novel products and they fail, you or the supplier, if there is a warranty, will bear the cost of the restocking on that. So in conclusion then, it's been fantastic to have so much interest and so much support from the sector for this research, which we're very grateful for, but it is still really early days for the formal research experiment, so we will keep you posted. And I think that's everything from me. Thank you very much. I'll just leave that in.
Thank you, Emily. It's probably unfair to ask you to take questions on somebody else's presentation.
I appreciate
but
that.
you're around all day, are you?
Yes, I am. Yeah.
But there's a little aside, my takeaway from that, when you mentioned Storm Arwen and being an extreme, of course, sadly, that's becoming more the norm. And anything we do has to cope with climate change, direct effects on the woodlands apart from anything else.